Michigan, 2013. After 15 years of silence, one of Flint's oldest cold cases suddenly breaks open, and the truth behind a missing teenager finally surfaces. 14-year-old Coral Hall had been a quiet, hopeful student trying to survive a turbulent home life under the roof of her grandmother, Lois Vanish. But when Coral vanished after calling a friend for help, all investigators found were whispers, contradictions, and a home filled with secrets. For years, the case drifted through dead ends and dying leads, until a confession revealed a crime far darker than anyone imagined. And the final twist came from the person Coral trusted most. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The story begins on a cool September evening in 1998, the kind of Michigan night where summer and autumn trade places hour by hour. In a small house on the outskirts of Flint, 14-year-old Coral Hall gripped a phone with trembling fingers. On the other end was a friend she trusted, one of the few places she felt safe enough to land when life at home became too heavy. Coral's voice was thin, strained, stretched tight with fear and exhaustion. She didn't go into detail about what the argument had been about this time. She didn't have to. Her friends already knew that conflict inside her grandmother's home was a familiar pattern. Volatile, unpredictable, and wearing her down piece by piece. For years, Coral had been living under the care of her grandmother, Lois Vanish, and Lois's boyfriend, a man whose presence had only deepened the sense of instability in the house. That night, Coral finally reached her breaking point. She asked her friend if she could stay over. "Just for tonight," she said. "Just enough time to breathe. Enough time to be away from the shouting, the tension, the walking on eggshells feeling that never seemed to leave her." Her friend agreed without hesitation. They made a simple plan. Coral would meet her later, somewhere familiar and easy to reach. No dramatic escape, no elaborate route, just a short walk from a place she no longer felt safe, toward a place where someone cared enough to listen. But Coral never arrived. Somewhere between that phone call and the moment she should have stepped through her friend's front door, she disappeared. Completely. When her friend realized Coral wasn't coming, she waited, first with worry, then with fear. Maybe Coral had been delayed. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe the argument had escalated and she couldn't get out. Hours passed with no sign of her. No messages. No knocks on the door. No footsteps in the driveway. And in the days that followed, that silence bloomed into dread. Looking back, investigators would learn that this call wasn't simply a frightened teenager seeking refuge. It was a warning. A final signal sent from a young girl trapped inside a home boiling with conflict, desperation, and secrets no one yet understood. Friends would later say they could hear something unusual in Coral's voice that night. An urgency, a quiet panic. It was the sound of someone trying to leave before something irreversible happened. A sound that, in hindsight, felt like the beginning of the end. There were no witnesses who saw Coral step outside. No neighbors reporting strange noises. No vehicle caught on camera. Flint was a city with dark corners and neglected streets. Places where people could vanish, unnoticed, in the space of a single moment. And so the most haunting question emerged, the one that still lingers decades later. What happened in the minutes after Coral hung up the phone? When Coral didn't show up for the arranged meetup, her friend tried to stay calm. Delays weren't unusual for Coral. Life in that household rarely moved in straight lines. Maybe the argument had gotten worse. Maybe she needed time to slip out unnoticed. Maybe she was simply waiting for the tension in the house to settle before making her exit. But as minutes turned into hours, that optimism evaporated. The night became a long, quiet ache. Every passing moment deepening the sense that something was profoundly wrong. Coral wasn't the type to ignore a friend's help. She never left someone waiting without calling back. And she certainly wouldn't abandon the chance to escape a place she so often feared returning to. By the next morning, the worry had hardened into alarm. Coral's friend reported her missing, stumbling through the explanation. The fight, the phone call, the plan that never unfolded. She wasn't sure if she should brace for tragedy or cling to the hope that Coral had simply found another place to go. Police quickly responded. Missing teens weren't uncommon in Flint in the late 1990s. Runaways, unstable homes, kids drifting through the cracks of an already strained city. But something about Coral's case felt different from the start. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, searching for anyone who might have seen a 14-year-old girl walking alone at night. No one had. Some neighbors didn't even know Coral lived there. Others mentioned hearing arguments from time to time, but nothing out of the ordinary the night she vanished. Then police turned their attention to the only adults responsible for Coral's welfare: her grandmother, Lois Vanishes, and Lois's boyfriend. Their responses were polite but hollow, emotionless, almost uninterested. They told officers Coral had stormed out after an argument and simply never came back. But their tone didn't match the gravity of what had happened. There was no panic, no urgency, no plea for help finding her. Instead, their statements felt strangely rehearsed, as if they were reciting answers from a script. Detectives noticed every detail. Lois rarely made eye contact. Her boyfriend answered questions with vague half-statements, as if guessing what the truth should sound like. Their timelines didn't quite align, and yet there wasn't enough evidence to confront them directly. There were no signs of forced entry. No neighbors reported suspicious activity. No discarded items or footprints or last-minute clues that would anchor Coral to a specific moment in time. It was as if the city had simply swallowed her. Investigators began to feel the first threads of frustration pulling tight. Another missing teenager. Another home fractured by conflict. And two adults whose reactions were disturbingly muted behind a wall of practiced calm. Police couldn't ignore the possibility that Coral had run away, but they also couldn't shake the more unsettling question rising beneath the surface of every interview, every inconsistent word, every quiet pause. Was Coral truly a runaway, or had something far darker unfolded inside that home after the phone call ended? As detectives dug deeper into Coral Hall's disappearance, they realized that the search for answers wasn't going to begin on the streets of Flint. It was going to begin inside the one place Coral feared most: her grandmother's home. Friends described Coral as someone constantly searching for a sense of belonging, a sense of calm, a place where she wasn't bracing for the next argument. She lived her life in a state of emotional readiness, always expecting the next outburst or accusation. Living with Lois Vanishes wasn't nurturing, it was survival. Lois's boyfriend, a man whose presence Coral rarely spoke about in detail, only intensified the unease. He hovered around the edges of her life like a storm always threatening to arrive. When investigators interviewed Coral's classmates, they heard fragments of the same theme. Coral often mentioned wanting to stay elsewhere. She hinted at problems at home, though she never named them outright. She described arguments that escalated out of nowhere, and moments when she felt unwelcome under her own roof. She was a 14-year-old girl walking through her life with adult-sized fear. Detectives knew that in cases like this, the truth often hid in what families didn't say. So they sat down with Lois again, this time with sharper questions. Immediately, they noticed something wrong. Lois's timeline shifted each time she repeated it. In one version, Coral stormed out around dinner. In another, she left after dark. In yet another, she wasn't even sure Coral had left at all. The boyfriend's recollections were even worse. He spoke as if the night had blurred into a haze, but not the kind of fog that comes from memory loss. More like the kind that comes from rehearsed detachment. He contradicted Lois on small details. Where Coral was standing, who said what, and when they last saw her. He struggled to keep his story aligned with hers. Their answers overlapped at times but never truly matched. To detectives, it sounded less like two people telling the truth and more like two people trying to remember the same lie. Then came the neighbors. Some reported hearing arguments in the days leading up to Coral's disappearance. Shouting, slamming doors, moments of chaos. Nothing definitive, but enough to sketch a picture of tension escalating inside the home. Others mentioned they rarely saw Coral outside, as if she were deliberately kept indoors or simply too afraid to leave unless necessary. With this information, detectives secured a closer look at the house. What they found wasn't obvious, but it was unsettling. There were no immediate signs of violence. No blood, No broken items, no overturned furniture. But investigators noticed small irregularities. Areas of the home appeared recently cleaned, almost too spotless for a place described as chronically disordered. A section of carpet seemed newer than the surrounding floor. Shelves had been rearranged. There was an unusual lack of dust in corners where no one normally cleaned. These details weren't incriminating on their own, but collectively, they painted a picture of a house preparing to hide something. Detectives also noted the atmosphere. Homes hold energy, some warm, some neutral, some heavy. This one felt hollow, as though something had been removed, not just physically, but emotionally. It was sanitized in a way that felt performative. Despite all these red flags, investigators lacked what they needed. A body, a witness, a confession. Coral seemed to have vanished into a vacuum, leaving behind only contradictions and suspicion. Her file risked becoming just another story of a missing teen from a troubled household. Cases that often drift into silence and never return. But even as the leads dried up, Lois herself kept pulling detectives back. There was something wrong in the way she spoke, something too controlled, too measured. Her inconsistencies were not random errors. They were patterns, patterns of avoidance, patterns of false certainty, patterns of someone constructing a story while hoping no one looked too closely. And every one of those patterns pointed toward the same chilling question. What was Lois hiding behind her shifting stories? In the months that followed Coral Hall's disappearance, investigators stayed close to the one person whose behavior had raised alarms from the beginning. Her grandmother, Lois Vanishes. They didn't push aggressively, not yet, but they watched, listened, and took meticulous notes. Lois's statements weren't simply inconsistent. They shifted like sand in the wind, changing shape every time detectives uncovered new details. Her words didn't behave like the truth. They behaved like strategy. When detectives asked her about Coral's emotional state, Lois brushed it off with dismissive certainty. Coral was moody, dramatic, acting out like any teenager. But when detectives spoke with Coral's friends, a different story emerged. One of fear, instability, and a teenager who longed to escape home more often than she dared admit. When they asked Lois to recount the argument from the night Coral disappeared, she minimized it. It wasn't serious, she would say. She just needed air. But when pressed for specifics, what time it happened, what was said, how Coral left the house, Lois's story shifted each time. In one version, Coral walked out calmly. In another, she stormed off. Then, inexplicably, Lois claimed she didn't see Coral leave at all. Lois's boyfriend was no help. He drifted through interviews with vague recollections and blurry answers. Sometimes he claimed to have been home during the argument. Other times he wasn't sure. At one point, he insisted he hadn't even spoken to Coral that day. Minutes later, he contradicted himself. His statements contradicted Lois's just enough to raise suspicion, yet overlapped enough to imply coordination. It was as if they were trying to remember a script written long after the event had passed. Detectives began to suspect a troubling dynamic in the home, one where silence was enforced, where fear operated quietly, and where Coral had learned to navigate conflict by seeking refuge outside rather than confronting it inside. Friends reported moments when Coral confided that her grandmother's temper scared her. She never gave details, but the emotion behind her words had been unmistakable. Rumors began circulating through the neighborhood as well. People remembered arguments, slamming doors, Coral appearing upset on the porch, and moments where the girl seemed to shrink around adults. No one had ever reported anything formally, but the pieces created a mosaic of unease. Detectives returned to the house several times, each time hoping to catch what they missed before. They examined the kitchen, the hallway, Coral's room, every corner that could hold even the faintest trace of a struggle. Nothing stood out as overtly violent, but there were subtle things that lingered in their minds. A section of carpet that appeared newer, a set of shelves suspiciously rearranged, a faint chemical smell days after the disappearance. These weren't conclusions. They were suspicions, but they were enough to keep the focus on Lois. Yet without a body, arrests were impossible. Without physical evidence, accusations meant nothing. Flint investigators had seen cases collapse under weaker circumstances. They needed more than instinct. They needed proof. Still, Lois's behavior continued to unravel in small but telling ways. Her answers became rehearsed, as if she was trying to remember the lies instead of living the truth. She requested fewer updates about the search. She seemed unmoved when police discussed the possibility of foul play. And when detectives tried to talk to her about Coral as a person, her dreams, her fears, her routines, Lois offered vague fragments, as though her granddaughter was a footnote rather than a child she'd raised. Every interview, every contradictory statement, every defensive reaction pushed investigators toward an increasingly unsettling realization. This wasn't a confused guardian. This was someone steering the investigation away from herself. Someone who seemed less concerned with finding Coral and more concerned with controlling the narrative. And so the question became impossible to ignore. Had they been looking at the perpetrator from the very beginning? As the months passed, the urgency surrounding Coral Hall's disappearance began to fade under the weight of new crimes, new emergencies, and the relentless pace of police work in Flint. What began as an active investigation slowly receded into a frustrating standstill. The leads dried up first, then the tips, then the people who once called daily for updates. With no body, no evidence, and no confession, Coral's case simply slid, inch by inch, toward the cold case files. Her name remained inked on the missing persons board for a while, surrounded by faces of other teenagers who had also vanished from unstable homes or violent neighborhoods. But over time, the board changed. New flyers went up. Old ones curled at the edges, faded from sunlight, and were eventually taken down. For detectives, the lack of progress became suffocating. They had followed every thread of Coral's last known moments until each unraveled into nothing. They re-interviewed friends, neighbors, school staff, even store clerks who claimed to have seen a girl matching her description. None of it gave them anything concrete. There was no evidence left to test. No secret sighting in another city. No anonymous caller offering a clue from the shadows. And Lois, whose inconsistent stories had initially seemed like the spark that might ignite a breakthrough, retreated into a quiet, guarded life. She and her boyfriend moved deeper into anonymity, staying out of public spaces, avoiding conversations about Coral, and maintaining an eerie silence that frustrated investigators. As the community's memory faded, Coral's absence became a haunting footnote, a story too thin for progress but too unsettling to forget. Inside the department, Coral's file gathered dust. It sat on an evidence room shelf, encased in a pale yellow folder, the pages inside covered with handwritten notes, interviews, and long lists of unanswered questions. Detectives who had once been driven by instinct drifted toward newer cases, pulled by the demands of a city overwhelmed by crime. Coral's case became something they thought about in quiet moments, never fully gone from their minds, but no longer within reach. Still, something unresolved clung to the edges of the file. Lois's inconsistent statements refused to be forgotten. They lingered in the margins of every report like a stain that couldn't be removed. Every time a detective passed the shelf where Coral's file lived, that contradiction flickered in their memory. Lois's stories didn't match because Lois wasn't telling the truth. Years later, the silence around the case shifted again, this time because of death. Lois's boyfriend, the man who had hovered so uneasily in investigators' interviews, passed away. With him went whatever secrets he had held. But his death didn't just close a chapter. It stirred the old embers of suspicion. Without him, Lois stood alone. And without him, the unspoken pact between the two adults who last saw Coral alive no longer held its shape. Whispers returned. Old questions resurfaced. Retired officers remembered details that had bothered them decades earlier. Friends of Coral, now adults, began to speak with more clarity, more courage. Someone eventually would break the silence. But at the time, detectives could only wonder. Would the truth ever surface? Or had Coral's story been buried forever? 15 years had passed since Coral Hall vanished from Flint, Michigan. 15 years of silence, unanswered questions, and a case file that sat dormant on a shelf, quiet but never forgotten. In 2013, That silence finally cracked when Flint Detective Sergeant Greg Hosmer decided to revisit the teenager's long, cold disappearance. Hosmer wasn't new to difficult cases. He had seen files full of false leads, dead ends, and witnesses whose memories blurred over time. But something about Coral's case stood out. It was the contradictions, the shifting stories, the uneasy feeling left behind by earlier investigators who, despite lacking evidence, had always sensed something was deeply wrong in that house. When Hosmer opened Coral's file, he didn't skim. He read every page, every interview, every scribbled note. What struck him immediately was how little had changed, how Lois's early statements were just as suspicious as they had seemed back then. Her timeline still didn't make sense. Her reactions still felt wrong. And the discrepancies in her story weren't the soft edges of memory fading over time. They were sharp breaks in logic. To him, they read like the footprints of a lie that had been repeated for so long, it began collapsing under its own weight. Hosmer began with fresh interviews. He contacted Coral's friends, now adults, who spoke with the clarity of people no longer afraid of consequences. They described a tense, unpredictable home life, one filled with arguments, fear, and moments where Coral hinted that something inside the house wasn't right. They remembered the final phone call, the panic in her voice, and her desperate plea for somewhere else to stay. Former detectives who had initially worked the case shared their lingering doubts. They remembered Lois's demeanor, her defensiveness, her contradictory statements. They remembered how the boyfriend seemed detached, evasive, and unnerved by simple questions. Most importantly, they remembered the feeling, an unspoken consensus that the truth was there, hidden between the cracks of two tightly guarded stories. Now all these memories resurfaced with renewed force. Hosmer wasn't bound by the emotional fatigue of those who had watched the case die years earlier. He was approaching it like a puzzle with missing pieces, determined to find where each one belonged. Eventually, he brought Lois back in for questioning. She was older now, 74 years old, and time had changed her face but not her evasiveness. Hosmer began slowly, revisiting details from her original statements, giving her room to speak freely. But as the questions narrowed, Lois's once confident answers began to fracture. Her stories didn't just shift, they broke. She contradicted herself within minutes. Hosmer pressed harder. He pointed out inconsistencies. He revisited timelines. He reintroduced statements from her boyfriend, forcing her to reconcile conflicting explanations she had once delivered with certainty. As the pressure built, Lois's facade began to crumble. Her voice hesitated. Her answers cracked. Her confidence slipped. Eventually, the weight of 15 years became too heavy for her to carry. The lies she had rehearsed could no longer protect her. And in one fractured, trembling confession, Lois finally admitted what investigators had always feared. Her words were chilling, not just for what they revealed, but for the ease with which they left her mouth after decades of silence. She hadn't slipped. She hadn't misremembered. She confessed. And what she admitted didn't just break the case open. It shattered every remaining piece of Coral's story that anyone believed they understood. What Lois revealed next would expose the darkest secret buried in Coral Hall's short, fragile life. When Detective Sergeant Greg Hosmer confronted Lois Vanishes with the contradictions in her story, he expected resistance. For 15 years, she had sidestepped questions, redirected suspicion, and blurred timelines until they were nearly impossible to untangle. But this time was different. This time, the room was quiet. Lois was older, tired, and alone. Her boyfriend long deceased, her lies stretched thin, and her control over the narrative slipping through her fingers. Hosmer spoke calmly, methodically pushing into the spaces where her story broke apart. Each question chipped away at the wall she had built around herself. Each contradiction tightened the pressure. And then, something in Lois shifted. Her voice wavered. Her shoulders collapsed inward. The mask she had worn for over a decade finally cracked. Her confession came out slowly at first, disjointed, fragmented, as if she were pulling each word from a place she never intended to expose. But once she began, the details spilled out with chilling clarity. She admitted that during an argument with Coral, an argument no one outside the home had ever fully understood. She struck the 14-year-old in the head with a hammer. She described it not as an accident or a moment of panic, but as a series of actions she chose to take. But what came next left investigators stunned. Lois revealed that after the killing, she and her boyfriend attempted to cover up the crime. The two adults, Coral's legal guardians, the very people responsible for her safety, dismembered the teenager's body before scattering the remains. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. It was an attempt to erase Coral entirely from the world, to scatter her into pieces small enough to keep hidden forever. At one point, Lois had even written a letter apologizing for dumping her granddaughter's body. The letter was brief, remorseful in tone, yet disturbingly detached from the brutality of what she described. It was as if she had long accepted the act itself but only now acknowledged the weight of the truth. Even with the confession, investigators needed to verify every detail they could. Lois agreed to guide them to possible locations where the remains had been discarded. Teams were sent into wooded areas, drainage sites, and remote patches of land just outside Flint. They dug. They sifted soil. They used cadaver dogs and heavy equipment. But after multiple searches, nothing was found. Coral had been gone for too long, and Lois's memory of the exact location had blurred over time. Still, the confession had power. It contained details no uninvolved person could have known, details consistent with some of the earliest unexplained clues in the case. The inconsistencies that once frustrated investigators now formed the backbone of a narrative that made sense only if Lois had always been the perpetrator. After 15 years of silence, deflection, and half-truths, police finally had what they needed. The truth, dark and unrelenting, had clawed its way to the surface. But as the shock of the confession settled, one question remained. Would Lois Vanishes finally face justice for the murder of Coral Hall? In 2013, the Genesee County Courthouse carried a tension that felt almost physical, like the weight of 15 years of silence pressing against every wall, every seat, every breath taken in the room. Reporters filled the back rows. Former investigators stood quietly near the aisle, men and women who remembered the case from its earliest days, who had once knocked on doors with Coral's photo in hand, hoping for a clue that never came. And at the center of the courtroom sat the woman whose name had hovered over the file since the day it first went cold. 74-year-old Lois Vanishes. Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton stepped forward and announced the charges with a solemn tone that reflected the gravity of the moment. Lois was being officially charged with an open count of murder, one of the rarest outcomes in a case where a victim's body had never been recovered. The announcement felt like a seismic shift. For the first time, Coral's disappearance wasn't just a mystery. It was a homicide case with a named perpetrator. Lois appeared frail, small in stature, but her presence cast a long shadow. She was arraigned and ordered held without bond, an indication of the severity of the crime she had confessed to and the brutality woven through every detail. The decision struck many as a rare moment of accountability in a case where the usual anchors of evidence, body, weapon, forensic proof, were absent. All they had were Lois's words, and those words were damning. Detective Sergeant Greg Hosmer took the stand to recount the confession. He spoke clearly, methodically, describing how Lois's years of contradictory statements had unraveled during questioning, how the truth had broken free through cracks in her stories, how the details she revealed, specific, graphic, and chilling, could only have come from someone who had been there when Coral died. Hosmer presented the confession not as a standalone moment, but as the culmination of 15 years of deception collapsing in on itself. Prosecutors built their narrative with precision. They emphasized the apology letter Lois had written, the admission of dumping her granddaughter's body, and her willingness to guide authorities to potential disposal sites, locations so remote and specific they could not have been fabricated by anyone outside the act itself. They highlighted how Lois's story, once full of evasions and contradictions, had hardened into something brutally clear. Coral had been killed, dismembered, and scattered. And Lois had been the one to do it. For Coral's remaining friends, adults now, carrying the memory of the girl who had called them for help that final night, The moment was bittersweet. Justice was finally coming into view, but it was justice with sharp edges. There would be no reunion, no recovery of remains, no gravesite to visit. The truth had surfaced, but it came without the closure they had once prayed for. For investigators who had kept Coral's file from fading entirely into the forgotten corners of the cold case archives, the charge was a vindication. Their instincts, their suspicions, their sense that something dark had happened inside that home, they had all been right. But even victory felt hollow. They had solved the case, but Coral would never be found. As the judge's gavel echoed through the room, one truth lingered like a shadow. Sometimes the darkest crimes hide in plain sight, tucked quietly behind the door of a home that looks ordinary from the outside. And in that courtroom, with Lois finally facing the consequences of her actions, everyone understood one thing with chilling clarity. Coral's story had always been far from ordinary. After Lois Vanishes's arrest, Coral Hall's story shifted in a profound way. For 15 years, it had existed in the cold silence of unanswered questions, circulating through whispers, rumors, and the dim corners of Flint memory. But with the truth exposed, brutal, devastating, undeniable, Coral's case entered a new phase. This time, it wasn't defined by investigative frustration. It was defined by reflection, reckoning, and a community forced to confront the fragility of the children living among them. Coral became more than a missing person poster or a name in a police file. She became a symbol, an emblem of the vulnerable teens who slip quietly through the cracks of unstable homes, whose warnings go unnoticed, and whose fear hides behind forced smiles and excuses. Her story echoed in school hallways, in neighborhood conversations, and in the minds of adults who once overlooked the subtle signs of distress in the children around them. For Coral's friends, now adults, the truth was both relieving and heartbreaking. They had waited for her the night she disappeared, convinced she would appear through a doorway or around a corner, carrying the weight of another fight, but still alive. They had held on to hope for years, imagining that Coral had run away to start over, or that she was out there somewhere waiting to be found. After Lois confessed, that hope shattered. Yet at the same time, it provided something they had long needed: clarity. The search was over, even if the grief had only begun. Investigators who had reopened the case felt a complex mix of victory and sorrow. They had been right to question Lois, right to follow their instincts, right to refuse to let Coral's story drift into permanent obscurity. But closure came with a cost. Knowing what happened was not the same as undoing it. And the reality of Coral's final moments, violent, lonely, hidden, left a stain on every page of the case file. Despite the confession, Coral's remains were never recovered. That absence became a reminder of how thoroughly the truth had been buried, both literally and emotionally, by the people responsible for her care. But it also fueled a new awareness across the community. Coral's story began to shape local conversations about missing youth, home instability, and the silent suffering that often goes unnoticed in teenagers navigating chaotic households. Her legacy took root in school counselors' offices, in social workers' meetings, in community safety programs. Adults began paying closer attention to patterns of fear, withdrawal, or sudden instability in young people. Coral's name became a quiet warning. Pay attention. Ask questions. Don't ignore the small signs. Coral's story is not one of disappearance. It is one of truth finally brought to light. A truth that refused to stay buried, even after 15 long years. And because of that truth, Coral Hall's name will not fade again. It will remain etched into the memory of a community that learned, too late, the cost of silence. Yet one haunting question lingers, echoing beneath every lesson her case taught. How many other stories like Coral's still wait in the shadows to be uncovered? Coral Hall's story is a devastating reminder of how truth can remain hidden for years, not because it's lost, but because it's buried by the very people entrusted to protect it. For 15 long years, her disappearance lived in the margins of cold case files, reduced to fragments of rumor and fading memory. Yet the truth was never far. It lived inside the walls of her grandmother's home, carried silently by the one person who should have kept Coral safe, not silenced her forever. When Lois Vanish finally confessed, It exposed not only the violence of that September night in 1998, but the years of manipulation, fear, and distortion that followed. Her admission revealed a crime driven by anger and followed by a desperate attempt to erase every trace of Coral's existence. And even though Coral's remains were never recovered, the confession gave investigators and loved ones the resolution they had been denied for so long. The case stands as a testament to the power of persistence in cold case work. One detective's decision to reopen a dusty file, one that many believed would never yield answers, returned Coral's voice to the world. His determination ensured that she would be more than a missing girl lost to time. Justice came late. Closure came imperfectly, but they came. And today, Coral Hall's story lives on as a call to pay attention to the quiet warnings, the troubled teens, and the truths hiding behind closed doors. If this case moved you, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story deserves to be remembered.